Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Davich, and I'm Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book, DeKalb County Public Library, and the DeKalb Library Foundation, welcome to another in our continuing series of virtual author events. We're so very excited to bring you this event this evening and would like to thank DeKalb Library Foundation for purchasing the Zoom account that we've been coming to you live for the past 14 months and bringing you author events into your home. If you would like to purchase a copy of tonight's book, Acapella is our bookseller this evening, and we of course will drop the ordering link right over in the chat for you to use. Once we finish the official presentation, if you'd like to ask any questions, we ask that you use the Q&A feature. That way we can keep track of the questions and make sure we ask them in turn. To use the Q&A feature, you will find the Q&A button either located at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on your device. We'll also have the closed caption feature for those people that need live transcription. You'll find the CC button located at the top or bottom of your screen as well. Of course, the climate change and our climate are very hot topics, and we're so very pleased to have Andreas Karelas here tonight. He has a message that we don't often hear, that we have the tools that we need to solve the climate crisis, and doing so will improve our lives, our economy, and our society. But to engage people in the climate fight, we need to see stories that are empowering, inclusive, and solutions-oriented, not based on fear. Karelas digs deep into the latest data on rapidly falling costs and increased efficiencies of clean energy technologies compared to fossil fuels. He looks at the rate of job creation in the clean energy sector and introduces the reader to the inspiring work of climate heroes on both sides of the aisle, from Republican mayors and governors to activists and business people of faith communities. Climate Courage shows us how we can move past our collective inaction on climate change and work together in our communities to create a more sustainable, just, clean energy powered economy that works for everyone. A guest of the Georgia Center for the Book several years ago, Bill McKibben, says, in the wake of the pandemic, nothing could help bring us out of the crisis in a more constructive way than working together to prevent the next one. Climate Courage offers a path towards getting back to something much better and a more united than our old normal. Andreas Karelas is the founder and executive director of Revolve, a nonprofit organization that empowers people around the country to help nonprofits in their communities go solar and raise awareness about the benefits of clean energy. He is a dedicated clean energy advocate with over 15 years of environmental and renewable energy experience. He is an Audubon Together Green Conservation Leadership Fellow and an Open IDEO Climate Innovator Fellow. He lives and works in San Francisco, and we are very, very pleased to have him here tonight to talk about his book, Climate Change. So will you please join me to welcome Andreas Karelas. Andreas?
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that warm introduction, and thanks everyone for being here tonight. It's a pleasure and an honor to get a chance to talk to you about my book, Climate Courage, how tackling climate change can build community, transform the economy, and bridge the political divide in America. And I think the last piece of the subtitle, Bridge the Political Divide in America, is probably the question that I get most often. Like, really? Climate change, solutions can bridge the political divide? How is that? It seems like it's such a politically divisive issue. So let's start there and unpack that a little bit. Is climate change a politically divisive issue? And if so, why? I'll start out with a little bit of information that was sort of shocking to me to find out, and something that is a theme throughout the book, which is mentioned by Katharine Hayhoe, who is a leading climate scientist and the author of the foreword of the book. And so one of the things that Dr. Hayhoe points out is that when Americans are surveyed about how often they talk about climate change and how often they hear about climate change, meaning how often are you talking about it with your friends or family members or coworkers around the water cooler, et cetera. Although I guess no one's been around the water cooler for some time, but before that, um, and 2/3 of Americans say they never talk about climate change with their friends or family, with people in their lives. They don't talk about it. Why not? We care about it. We are concerned about the future of our planet. Why don't people talk about it one way or the other? Frankly, because it's become a polarized issue, or at least people believe it is, meaning it's a taboo subject to talk about. It's like religion or politics or money or sex. Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to bring it up. It's just one thing that you don't bring up in conversation. Why? Because you don't know what the other people's perspective is. You don't know what their view is. And so it tends to be this conversation that is on people's minds, but it's not being had. And there's some really good, sort of reasoning around that. Why don't we talk about it? Well, let's let me sort of ask a question. If you've had this experience before, have you ever read a book or watched a movie or watched a news report about climate change, and all of a sudden you were feeling really motivated to act? You were feeling very much like, we got to do something. This is it. I'm ready to take action here. And then all of a sudden, they show you at the end what it is that you're to do about it. They give you a list of things that you could potentially do. And instead of it being something that seems reasonable or realistic or impactful, instead, what they ask you to do is put air in your tires, uh, ride your bike more often, use a reusable grocery bag, etc. And these are all important things to do. Don't get me wrong. We all need to do our part in terms of changing the consumptive habits in our community. But the point is that when we are told about climate change, it's this huge, scary problem that, if we truly understand it, understandably should scare the crap out of us, right? I mean, let's be honest. It is an extremely scary situation. And then when it comes to what can I do about it as an individual, then it gets really murky, right? Then it gets to, well, why don't you, take these small piecemeal sort of, actions? And the question is that going to amount to anything? In other words, the feeling that we have, and I'm sure many of you have felt this, is this feeling of disempowerment. It's a feeling of, well, what am I supposed to do about it? It's so big, it's so scary. I hope the government solves it. Um, but what is little old me supposed to do? So it's a disempowering conversation. And frankly, uh, as an old professor of mine used to say, the environmentalist is oftentimes not the popular person at the party. Nobody wants to talk to the person who's bringing up the fact that the ice caps are melting, and all of the horrible things that we are now experiencing due to climate change. Uh, and so we don't bring it up, because what are you going to say? What are you going to do? It's a very sort of difficult conversation to have in that way. The other reason is that, because of this polarizing nature, because we've heard it told from the media, from the political establishment, that it is a polarized issue, that we hear about Republican politicians thinking about it one way, Democrat politicians thinking about it another way, and it's been painted in this light. Now, one of the important things that we have to realize is that, and this is what Catherine Hayhoe says, is that the most important thing we can do about climate change is talk about it. Talk about it, right? If 2/3 of Americans aren't talking about it, then that means we need to start talking about it. We need to have the courage to talk about it. We need to bring it up with our friends and family and ask them their views on it, and be willing to share our views and our opinions and our questions. And it's okay to not know everything. We just have to get that conversation started, because once we get that conversation started, then we're actually going to find a lot more commonality, and we're going to find a lot more places where we agree. And of course, one of the main messages of the book is that there are actually a lot of positive stories that we can be telling about climate change. There are a lot of positive narratives that we can be putting out there that will get people excited, that will get people motivated, that will get them inspired to take action. And it doesn't have to be all this doom and gloom. It doesn't have to be all, oh, what's the latest in Washington? It's, let's look at the community level. Let's see what's happening in our neighborhoods. Let's see what's happening in our cities and counties and states, and see how much renewable energy is being deployed, and hear about these incredible entrepreneurs and community leaders and youth and faith communities, et cetera, that are taking action out of their own volition, right? And if we hear more stories like that and we tell more stories like that, then that will change the narrative um, at the local level and eventually at the national level. And that's what the book is about. And that's what I believe is the most important thing we can do to help solve the climate crisis, is tell a new narrative, tell an inspiring narrative that's empowering, and that puts the ability to solve the climate crisis back in our hands. Now, for many of us, the way it's portrayed is all we hear about is the doom and gloom. All we hear about is how bad it's getting, and it's getting worse and worse. So what's there to talk about? There is no empowering side of that. But the reality is that when we look at it, and I'll get into this in a little bit, that the trends are all moving in our favor in terms of the solutions. Why? Because the cost of clean energy is dropping. The amount of clean energy that's being deployed is rising exponentially around the world and in this country, and it's creating jobs, and it's creating savings, and it's creating better health, and it's improving the quality of our lives. So these are the types of things that can use our support, and that we can implement in our communities, and that we can get people excited about, we can talk about. Now, one of the things that's important to recognize is that when we are speaking to someone about an issue that they may find to be polarizing, like climate change, we have to learn how to approach that person. We need to learn how to speak to them in a way that they're open to listening to what it is that we're saying. One of the things that I found in the book as I was researching and writing that was very exciting for me was the fact that the human brain processes information perhaps slightly differently than we might think. The climate movement, if you look at all the publications and the research, et cetera, that's been coming out for many years, it all really points to this idea that let's hit people over the head with the data, right? We have to keep carbon in the atmosphere below 350 parts per million, and we have to reduce our carbon emissions by 2030 by 50%, or otherwise we won't hit 2 degrees Celsius in terms of warming, right? It's a lot of numbers, it's a lot of figures, it's a lot of data. Numbers and figures and data speak to the rational part of our brain, uh, what psychologists refer to as the prefrontal cortex. And this part of the brain is where logic happens. It's where planning happens. It's where a lot of thinking happens, and it's where we can process data and facts and things like that. It's our logical sort of brain. But there's the other part of our brain, which is our emotional brain. And the emotional brain does not respond to facts and logic and reason. It responds to what's its gut instinct. And this is actually a much more ancient part of our brain, and it is a much more impactful part of our brain in terms of our decision making. What does that mean? It means that when someone is telling you a story, or trying to convince you of something, or trying to sort of get your opinion changed, that if they are merely speaking to the rational part of our brain and hitting you over the head with facts and figures, that you're likely going to tune them out if you don't emotionally resonate with what it is they're saying. Whereas if you approach someone from an emotional perspective, you try to get their perspective, you try to speak to commonalities that you have, things that you both care about, things that you share common interests around. Well, then emotionally, this person can trust you. Emotionally, this person can believe what it is you're saying, or at least be willing to listen to you, right? I'm sure we all understand this type of dynamic and have had it happen to us. Um, I'll read a short passage from the book that kind of explains this. Uh, Bob Inglis was a congressman, a Republican congressman from South Carolina. And he actually lost his seat because he took a bold stance on climate change at a time when his constituents were not open and ready to moving outside of the Republican Party line in his area, which was that they didn't want to deal with climate change. So what he says is this. Former South Carolina Congressman Bob Inglis, a Republican, describes it this way, quote, "What happens often when the left is talking to the right about these issues, it seems like it's coming across as, we know better than you do. You're a bunch of hicks from the sticks. We're so much smarter than you are. We've got scientists who tell us this and that. We'll design a regulatory system that will fix things because we can't trust you to make good decisions." That's one way it comes across, and it's offensive to conservatives. And so that to me is so important for us to understand. How is it that these messages are being communicated? How is it that this information is coming across? Because for those of us that know and care about climate change, how did we learn about it? Someone we trusted explained the concept to us one day, or we saw a documentary, or we read an article, or we watched a series, or somehow we received information from a trusted source that changed our mind and said, "Oh my goodness, there's this really scary, crazy problem that's happening." And if people out there haven't come around to understand that climate change is real and caused by humans, it's because they haven't had that experience yet. And somebody needs to do it. And that could be you. And so here's how you do it. You have to change the tone. You have to change it to be a more empowering and inspiring narrative. Now, another important factor that will be revealed when we start talking to other Americans about climate change is that it's actually a lot less polarized, a lot less polarizing than we realize. If you watch the news, you might think this is, down the party lines. Half of America thinks that climate change is real, and the other half doesn't care about it or doesn't want to do anything about it. And that couldn't be further from the truth. That's wrong. What's right is that actually 2/3 of Americans find climate change to be personally meaningful to them. 67% say that climate change is personally meaningful to them. 73% of Americans believe that climate change is real and caused by humans, right? Um, and here's the big takeaway. Here's my favorite piece of research that I found in the entire 2 years writing the book. 85% of Americans would like to see America be 100% renewable energy powered. Let me say that again. 85% of Americans are in favor of 100% clean energy. How many issues in America today do 85% of Americans agree on? Right? I mean, let's be real. Uh, there are not a lot of issues that cross party lines as deeply and have as much broad support as clean energy does. Clean energy is a win-win-win across the board. Everybody loves it, or at least 85% of Americans do, which is pretty darn good. So that's where we need to start. If you understand that, it's going to make it a whole lot easier to bring it up with your friends, to bring it up at work, to bring it up at your kid's school and say, hey, let's get on with this. Let's do something. What can we do to help accelerate the clean energy revolution? What can we do to start implementing climate change solutions in our community? Because you know what? 85% of Americans are on board. Let's get clean energy deployed in our community ASAP. Now, how exactly will this look when we get to 100% clean energy? Well, looks pretty darn good. Mark Jacobson, who is a professor of civil engineering at Stanford University, he and his team have put together a roadmap that shows what it will look like when the United States reaches 100% clean energy. And what they found is that when we achieve 100% clean energy, not only will we be creating 2 million new jobs, net increase of 2 million new jobs, right? So after you've accounted for everyone who loses their job, which, let's be real, people will lose their job as we move away from fossil fuels, hopefully will become employed in the clean energy industry, although, may not. Once we've accounted for job losses, even counting those losses, you're looking at a net increase of 2 million new jobs in the United States. That sounds pretty cool. How about savings? $1 trillion a year Americans will save on their electricity bills once we've achieved 100% clean energy. $1 trillion a year. What could we do with $1 trillion a year back in our pockets as American citizens saving on our electricity bills? It's massive. It's absolutely massive. And that's not even to mention the fact that the impact that it will have on the environment. So that's where we need to start, is looking at the opportunities that are in front of us. Now, you may be saying to me, well, Andreas, this all sounds well and good, but what real examples do we have of people across the aisle working together towards solutions? Well, I'm glad you asked, because there's actually one of my favorite stories in the book is from your state of Georgia. There was a woman named Debbie Dooley, who is a diehard Republican. In fact, she was one of the founders of the Tea Party. And in the mid 2000s, Georgia Power was limiting the ability for people to put solar panels on their roof and to claim all the value of the electricity that they were providing. And so Debbie Dooley, one of the founders of the Tea Party, said, well, wait a minute. This is my roof. These are my solar panels. I'll be damned if the utility is going to come in, the monopoly utility is going to come in and tell me that I can't generate my own power, that I can't be energy independent. And so in order to fight back against the utility, she reached out to a very unlikely ally, the Sierra Club, the nation's oldest environmental organization. And together they joined forces, the Tea Party and the Sierra Club, and they called it the Green Tea Coalition, the Green Tea Party, right? This was right here in Georgia. And I'll read you a short passage here about Dooley. So what she says is, I talked at the Tea Party convention and said government should stop picking winners and losers. I got thunderous applause. People are really receptive to the right message when you lay the facts out. I've been attacked by Koch brothers affiliated groups. Some said I was a fake Tea Party person. I just laughed. I'm a conservative. There's no way they can paint me as a liberal, even as a moderate. I am a right-wing conservative. But I'm extremely passionate about alternative energy. I'm a grandmother. I became a grandmother in 2008 with the birth of a grandson who is the light of my life. I want him to have a clean world. I want him to have parks and green space. I don't want him to have to worry about terrorist attacks. I want him to be able to breathe clean air. I want him to be able to generate his own electricity if he so chooses. If he says, I want to generate my own power and be self-sufficient, I want him to be able to have the ability to do it. And then I go on, Dooley knows that conservatives have been, quote, brainwashed for decades into believing that we're not damaging the environment, end quote. So when she speaks to conservatives about the benefits of renewable energy, she approaches the issue through things she knows they care about: energy choice, energy freedom, national security. If you first connect with people on shared values, then you, quote, have a receptive audience that will listen to you, she points out. But if you, quote, lead off with climate change, they're not going to pay a bit of attention to anything else you say, end quote. And that, again, is, I feel she really understands the core message of this book, which is that it's not that we don't share values. We all, as she just described, we all want to have green spaces. We all want to have a healthy environment. We all want to have a livable planet for our children and grandchildren. It's how you approach people, and it's reaching them at the level where they already are. And so that, to me, and again, when it comes back to the jobs that we have available to us, let me read another section that describes what it is that we're talking about. It's not just solar installers, putting panels on the roof. We're talking about a fundamental transformation of the economy, and that means an entire revitalization of the economy. It means jobs in every sector. So this is among what the 2 million new jobs will look like once we've achieved 100% renewable energy. So I write, while predictions about the energy future timeline vary, the overarching story remains the same. With or without the federal government's support, we're quickly moving to a renewable energy powered country and world strictly because it's cheaper to produce. That means new technologies, new industries, new manufacturing processes, and new business models will reshape our society in the coming decades more than we can possibly imagine. And it's widely accepted that renewable energy employs more people per unit of energy created than fossil fuels. Long story short, that means new jobs and lots of them: manufacturing jobs, sales jobs, installation jobs, maintenance jobs, customer service jobs, the majority of which can't be outsourced. But this isn't just a pipe dream. We're already seeing the growth of jobs in the renewable sector outpace the rest of the economy dramatically. So, right now, we're seeing solar energy jobs, for example, increase at 14 times the national average. There are more people, there are twice as many people employed by the solar energy industry right now than all the people working in the fossil fuel industry in the power sector, right? That's massive, especially when you think of how little solar energy contributes right now to the overall energy mix. In other words, as clean energy, particularly solar, continues to be adopted around the country, you're going to see more and more jobs in communities around the country. Now, one of the things that is really important, one of the things that we have in the fight against climate change, is that clean energy, particularly solar energy, is contagious. What do I mean by that? It means that when someone goes solar, their neighbor and their neighbor are more likely to go solar. It's called the seeding effect. And you see this happen across the country. So, what that means is that when we're looking for things that we can do to help solve the climate crisis, it really starts at the community level. Yes, it's important to focus on our individual actions. Yes, we should be reducing our carbon footprint in every way possible, because that also sends a signal to the economy, and it sends a signal to our neighbors that this is how we all should be living. And yes, we should also be involved in the political process. We should be calling our senators and our congress people and telling them that we care about these issues. But for a lot of people, those things might seem like they're not going to ultimately be what solves the climate crisis. What we need to do is organize solutions at the community level. This means putting up solar on our homes, on our community centers, on the places where we spend time with each other, so that we can see the benefits of clean energy in our community, and that will help to create a ripple effect so that more and more people can go solar. For example, there's another wonderful story that I tell in the book about a mayor named Dale Ross. And Dale Ross is from the city of Georgetown, Texas. Uh, and he's a conservative Republican. And surprisingly, Georgetown, Texas is now the second city in America after Burlington, Vermont, to be 100% powered by renewable energy. How is it that this conservative Republican mayor led his city to become 100% renewable energy powered? Because he looked at the economics of it and he realized that he could sign up long-term renewable energy procurement contracts that would be cheaper and that would save his city money over the next 20 years as opposed to any other option. Not only that, he realized it would help the city save water. It would also help attract companies to want to locate their businesses in his city because then those companies could say that they were 100% renewable energy powered. These are the trends that you're seeing. And what's important to note is that the more we tell stories like this, look at the Green Tea Party that came out of Georgia, look at the Republican mayor in Georgetown, Texas, that helped his city go 100% renewable energy. These are the types of stories that change the narrative, that make us realize that there are heroes on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, that are working hard towards these issues, and they're mostly happening at the local level. And that's where all the traction is happening. Unfortunately, we're not seeing the traction at the federal level. Even if you had heard me give this book talk a month ago, I would have sounded a lot more optimistic. And I'm a pretty optimistic guy. I would have been a lot more optimistic at that point that we were going to see massive, substantial climate change legislation from Joe Biden's infrastructure package getting passed through Congress. If you're reading the news today, it seems like, and granted, who knows what's going to happen, and I pray that the climate change legislation that was originally proposed does get passed. But I'm not holding my breath, right? Even now at the federal level, there is pushback, there is waffling. They want to do the infrastructure bill without the climate change measures, and we simply don't have time for that type of waffling. We don't, and more importantly, for those of us that are listening to this call, we as citizens don't have time to wait for the government to figure this out and solve it. They've been LBJ, President Johnson had a report put on his desk in 1965 that laid out the climate crisis. And I talk about this in the book. It laid it out very accurately. They predicted exactly what the types of impacts would be. They predicted that we would cross 400 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere by more or less around when it happened, right? So the government has known about this problem for half a century, and we're still debating it in the halls of Congress. I'm laughing, but it's not funny. I'm laughing because it's crazy. It's really crazy. Um, so what does that mean? It means that the stories like Debbie Dooley and the stories like Dale Ross working in their community, working even opposed to their political party, are making the transition happen. And that's why we're seeing in the United States last year in 2020, 70% of all new energy generation that was built was, you guessed it, renewable energy. Around the world, it was 80%. Around the world, it was 80% of new energy last year was renewable energy. So that's the transition. That's where we're heading. There is no economic viable path for the fossil fuel industry. They are going to be bankrupt in the very near future. The writing is on the wall. Jim Cramer, a host of Mad Money, has called the fossil fuel industry the new tobacco. And he says we're in the death knell phase of the industry, right? So we are moving towards a clean energy economy. People on both sides of the aisle are doing it, and we have to be focused at the community level to continue to put that forward. Um, so, this is really the moment that we are in. And this is what we need to be focused on telling ourselves. Also, at the faith level, a lot of folks in the faith community have led this. Young evangelicals, evangelical climate action groups across the board. Young Republicans certainly feel more strongly about climate change than older Republicans. Um, Industry, you're seeing 5 out of the top 6 most highly valued companies in the world are now 100% renewable energy powered. Why is that? Why do Google and Amazon and Facebook and all of these places, why have they gone 100% renewable? Is it because their customers are really, clamoring them to do so? Yes, that's part of it. Part of it is that consumer demand is driving companies to make decisions that will impact the climate in a positive way. Number one. But more importantly, is it's the bottom line. They realize that the costs of fossil fuels will only continue to go up as they get harder and harder to reach and extract and process, et cetera. By the way, we had a big win last week with the Keystone XL pipeline being permanently shut down, thanks to decades of activism from climate activists. Um, so these companies realize that the cost of fossil fuels are only going to continue to go up, and the cost of clean energy is only going to continue to go down. And you're only going to see more and more companies, more and more cities, more and more states leading in that direction. And a large part of that is driven by what we do in our community, what you and your neighbors can do. So, for example, I love to tell this story. The Sierra Club has a campaign called Ready for 100. And what they've done is they have trained groups of volunteers across the country to go into their community and convince the local elected officials, whether that's the city, county, or state level, to set a commitment to reaching 100% renewable energy. They've been so successful at this in just the last few years. They've been so successful. Volunteers, citizens, just like you and I, around the country, convincing elected officials to commit to 100% renewable energy, to commit to 100% renewable energy. They've been so successful that now 1 out of every 3 Americans lives in a area that is committed to 100% renewable energy. 1 out of 3. And that's just from citizen action. That's not from the federal government. That's not from the United Nations. That's from you and I and people like us who are passionate about this issue, who have found their climate courage to go out and take action, to start those conversations, and to see where those conversations lead. Uh, the nonprofit that I started 10 years ago is called Revolve. And what we do is also based on community action, citizen action. We train volunteers who we call our solar ambassadors, who any one of you could become a solar ambassador. Uh, and what we do is we train our volunteers to go into their community and find nonprofit organizations, schools, churches, homeless shelters, health clinics, animal shelters, food banks that could benefit from solar power, and help that nonprofit understand how to benefit from solar power. And Revolve then provides financing for those organizations to go solar. And then we create a ripple effect in that community. We tell stories about that nonprofit going solar, and so on and so forth. For example, in South Carolina, uh, we had a team of solar ambassadors from Coastal Carolina University. And those students went to the local VFW, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and they talked to the veterans, and they asked them what they felt about climate change, and they asked them how much they cared about clean energy. And they were able to convince this VFW in Little River, South Carolina, to go solar. Once we put solar panels up on the roof of that VFW, that story was actually picked up and written about in an op-ed that helped contribute to a major policy win in the South Carolina legislature around solar energy. Number one. Number two, that same Coastal Carolina team of ambassadors then helped another VFW in the next town over go solar the following year. That's the ripple effect. And think about this, when you're sitting down to watch TV in Little River, South Carolina, and you turn on the TV, and there was a 5-minute TV news spot on these Coastal Carolina students talking to the veterans about the solar system, and you got to hear from the veterans about why they cared about climate change and why they cared about going solar. If you might not have cared about solar and climate before that, but maybe you were a veteran, or maybe you know somebody who's a veteran, or maybe you care about veterans, all of a sudden you're going to feel a little bit differently about that issue, right? It's no longer going to be, oh, this thing that Al Gore cares about, and all these, environmentalists, but I don't care about that. Once you see, oh, look at that, there's a whole group of veterans down the street who have gone solar, and they care about it, and they are talking about how the Department of Defense cares about it, that this is a national security issue, and that this is about us helping people in our community. That's the type of narrative that we want to be telling. That's about climate courage. It's about people finding that courage inside of themselves to take an action, even if it's the littlest action you can think of. Take that action and tell your friends about it. And we actually have in the book, we have a whole list of actions that you can take. And on the website, climatecourage.us, we also have a whole bunch more list of actions that you can take. So I really am happy to be here with you all tonight, especially lucky to be able to share the story about the great work that's been happening in Georgia, with you all. And I'll pause here, and I'm excited to hear your questions. Thanks again for having me.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andreas. And don't forget, if you'd like to ask a question, do feel free to type it into the Q&A section. We do have a couple coming in. I do have to say, I want to thank you for including Debbie Dooley and all of those Southern examples to bring it home to us down here in the South. Sometimes viewed as a little more conservative. We kind of changed that tide a little bit lately. But what I do find interesting about your book, not only when you talk about Debbie Dooley, and I loved that section, but you also mentioned a lot of large companies and what large companies are doing that. And you mentioned in your probably about a minute ago how these large companies are going solar and what they are doing to climate. But you also mentioned Coca-Cola. So what is Coca-Cola doing?
Coca-Cola, yeah, Coca-Cola is, and I know you guys got the big museum there, and haven't been, but there is a group called RE100, and this is a group of corporations that are committed to 100% renewable energy. And as I mentioned, I mentioned the top 5 highly valued companies, or of the top 6, 5 of them are committed to 100% renewable energy, like Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, etc. But also on that list, and you can go, they have a website, RE100. If you check it out, you'll see on there, Coca-Cola is also 100% committed to is committed to 100% renewable energy. So is Nike. So is a whole host of organizations that you might not have realized what they were doing. Walmart, Salesforce, right? These are corporations that, again, Walmart is a perfect example. I got to hear a spokesperson from Walmart a few years ago speak on a panel. And one of the things she said is, we're not advertising this in every store. You don't see on big billboards that Walmart is 100% renewable energy powered, because frankly, we're not sure if the customers are all really going to be excited about it. But they're doing it because internally they know, number one, they do have, and people will, they're not perfect, but they do have an internal sustainability goal that they are shooting for. But more importantly, it's the bottom line. Renewable energy is going to save them money over time. So whether a company cares about the climate or not, whether they care about it from a moral perspective, from a financial perspective, money talks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we have a couple questions coming in, and there was a really good one from Greg. I'm going to kind of wrap it around another point that you make in your book as well. Although I've been here in Georgia for a while, and I'm the director of the Center for the Book here in Georgia. I did grow up in West Virginia. I was born and raised in West Virginia. It's changed a lot from I've been 16 years in Georgia. It's definitely changed a lot since I left. But one of the things that was starting there were two things that were starting when I left. Was one, mountaintop removal by the coal mining industry, and two, the addition of windmills on the mountaintops for wind energy, and those definitely created very heated arguments. You saw folks driving around with all the Friends of Coal stickers and things like that. And you do mention Dan Conant from West Virginia in there
Yes.
as well, in his solar. But wind energy, it's very strange, like driving through West Virginia when I go back to visit, and I don't know what looks stranger, the windmills on the mountains, sort of like in these very, horizon lining rows. Or I think what is actually worse is the very, sparse, almost lunar landscape of these mountaintops that have been blasted to try and get the last, nearly unminable veins of coal out of them. But so if you know anything about the wind energy, we'd like to hear about that. But Dan's question asks, and it's kind of like what I saw back at home. He said, don't lots of people believe that the media that we're used to watching more than someone who talks to them? And if the fossil fuel companies think that they might be threatened, won't they increase advertising spending in other ways to change people's positions? And I kind of mentioned that you saw a lot of it was almost like the miner's tattoo, that you had this Friends of Coal sticker on your car, and then if you didn't, that you weren't a friend of coal, or weren't supportive of a miner and him keeping his job and things like that.
Yeah, no, that's a really powerful question, and it really, yeah, I mean, the Friends of Coal, I totally get that. Why do we care? Because we care about that person, we care about that family member. Our parent or grandparent worked in the coal industry, and we have a strong sense of appreciation and responsibility for that. So I totally get that. Um, and yeah, to the question around the media and the advertising, uh, we're in a really tricky spot because the media, one of the things I talk about in the book is the media's coverage of climate change. And so, for example, um, there was a report that had come out, uh, that talked about how 97% of scientists uh, around the world were in agreement that climate change is real and caused by humans. And and then if you were to watch Fox News, they had over 2/3 of the pundits talking about this report, uh, doubting the belief in climate change, right? So that's the skew that you're seeing. It's so apparent how skewed it is, and then they interview people who either watch no Fox News, a little Fox News, or all Fox News, and their belief in climate change is completely in line with their amount of Fox views watching, which is absolutely insane. And frankly, it's criminal what's happening. And of course, it's not just around climate; it's around so many issues. Um, so and you're 100% right that the fossil fuel industry has and will continue to spend billions of dollars in order to convince Americans that its product, burning of fossil fuels, is not causing the climate crisis. And in fact, this is a very important piece of the book that is really important for all of us to understand, is that the fossil fuel industry used the same consulting firms that the tobacco industry used in order to convince America that smoking cigarettes didn't cause lung cancer. So when the tobacco companies realized that they had they had a problem on their hands, their main product was killing people, they hired these consultants to go out and create misinformation campaigns that sowed doubt in the American mind. They didn't necessarily say it doesn't cause cancer. They just said, we're not sure. The verdict is unclear. We're still figuring it out. And so when the fossil fuel industry, which by the way, they knew, their internal scientists knew that the climate crisis was real and that they were causing it as well from the 60s, right around the time when LBJ found out, they started hiring these consultants, the same firms that the tobacco industry used in order to sow doubt in Americans' minds about the fossil fuel industry's impact on climate change. And so the point being, I don't think that we can stop that. Like, they are going to continue to pour millions of dollars into misinformation campaigns. The language, of course, has changed over the years. It originally was climate change is just a hoax, to okay, climate change is real, but it's not caused by humans, to okay, it's caused by humans, but there's nothing we could do about it, and it's going to be too expensive, for us to try, right? So the narrative has changed over the years, but it's always the same message. And the media and the politicians, who, let's be honest, are corrupt. We have a corrupt political system in this country. Many of the politicians, due to the way that campaign financing works, are literally repeating talking points that are given to them from the fossil fuel industry. So can we stop people from hearing that type of narrative from the politicians and from the media and from the fossil fuel industry? No, we can't. But what we can do is counter that narrative by speaking amongst ourselves, speaking to each other in our communities, using the voice that we have, which is our culture, right? How can the culture shift to say, are you kidding me? We're not buying this anymore. We are not, you can't keep pulling the wool over our eyes. We see the impacts. We see the storms slamming into the Gulf Coast year after year. We see the West Coast burning worse and worse every year. We understand that this is climate change and it can't be denied. And we also see that brands like Coca-Cola are going 100% renewable energy because it's good for the environment. And we see, and because it's good for the bottom line, and we see that West Virginia is not just investing in coal, but that they're putting up wind turbines. And you mentioned Dan Conan, who's a friend of mine, and his company Solar Holler, which Solar Holler is actually training former coal miners to become solar installers, right? And increasing the solar adoption in West Virginia. So those are the kinds of narratives that we can tell. That's what we want to get on the news. That's what we want to write about and tell our friends about and share at our community gatherings. And that's how we can try to change the cultural narrative.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andreas. And I always like to tell everybody, I may live in Atlanta, but I was a coal miner's daughter. So, I always have to throw that in there. So, but speaking of fossil fuels, and, when you were talking about, the fossil fuel industry hiring, of course, the advertisers, the same ones that use tobacco, I just flashed back to that scene in Mad Men where they're like, our tobacco is toasted. We're not going to say anything. We're just say our tobacco is toasted, and let people think of homesy, folksy cooking and think it's toasted, to kind of steer them away from what could be addictive behaviors and things like that. But while we're on the topic of fossil fuels, Marnie has a question about the automotive industry, and she asks, is Detroit working on cars that run on something other than gas or electricity? Because even once again, I have to, my parents still do live in West Virginia, and it is about 600 miles from my doorstep to their doorstep. So even when I think about getting an electric car, I'm like, Ooh, that's a little farther than the range of an electric car. And kind of once I get into Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, not maybe going to be able to find a recharging station easily in the Appalachian mountain chain. So can you speak to any of that?
Absolutely. Well, I think so. So to the answer to answer the question of is there anything besides fossil fuels and electric vehicles? And yes, there are uh, folks that, and I think there will be very distinct uses for hydrogen. So there are hydrogen cars, and there was for a time a large wave of interest from the automotive industry that hydrogen cars are going to be the wave of the future. Now, unfortunately for those folks, that didn't pan out, and the future will be electric cars. We will start seeing electric cars. For example, one of the stories I talk about in the book is GM, uh, in Detroit is now building uh, the electric Hummer, right? So you can buy a 100% electric Hummer. It goes 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. It's this incredible American, iconic vehicle that's now 100% electric. But actually, since the book has come out, it's actually become even more exciting in terms of what electric vehicles look like. So uh, we're seeing, you know, companies like Ford coming out with the Ford F-150 that's now all electric, right? It sold 20,000 trucks in the first 12 hours that it was available. You're seeing companies like GM, as I mentioned, that are making claims that by 2035 they will only sell electric vehicles, and my guess is that it's probably going to be a lot sooner than that. Even Toyota, who has, when I mentioned hydrogen, Toyota had originally been thinking that they would be focused on hydrogen cars. They've actually completely pivoted such that now by 2025, they plan on only making electric vehicles. So we are moving into a world. Now, what would have been cool, and what still could be cool, is the Biden infrastructure plan. One of the main sort of pieces of that was to build out electric charging station electric charging station network around the country, so that you could drive 600 miles and be able to stop and charge, with fast-paced supercharging stations, which maybe would take a few minutes, but probably along the lines of what you would need to take a break and go in and get a snack and use the facilities anyway, right? So that's the type of thing that we're going to see. Of course, the batteries and the range of these vehicles is getting higher and higher, and and the good thing is that we, as opposed to hydrogen, which would be really hard to think about, how do you get hydrogen everywhere? Electricity is everywhere, right? You could plug it in at home, in your garage. You can plug it in when you get to work. You can plug it in downtown, right? And those. So we are, when you see, and of course California, Washington State have all made pledges that we are only going to allow electric vehicles by certain dates. So at this point, the ship has sailed, and we will be moving into an electric vehicle future. I do believe that there will still be that hydrogen will still play a role in transportation, most likely for shipping, and perhaps aviation. Where big batteries will make it harder for that, and maybe even some long haul trucks and things like that. But transportation is not my expertise, but from what I can tell, vehicles will be almost all electric within the decade, and hydrogen will also play a role in the transportation sector.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we have a question from Gordon, who asks, Democrats love parks and trees, and Republicans love golf courses and are willing to pay for them to be private and exclusive. The existence of both depends on clean water, air, and of course, not extreme heat. What other methods can we use to preserve our environment? A little bit, kind of like a little bit roundabout, but I see where he's going with that.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think, one thing to point out is that, you know, John Muir, one of the sort of leading, pioneering sort of environmentalists of our country, uh, worked with Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican president, to initiate the first protected lands in the United States. And those protected lands then eventually became the National Park Service. The United States created that concept. No other country in the world had ever created a national park. No other country had ever created a protected wild area, and that was a pioneering concept by the United States, and as I should say just again, by a Republican president, a conservative, because conservation is right there in the name, right? It is about conserving the wild and beautiful heritage that we have been given. This country is so beautiful, and we have a duty to maintain it for future generations. So um, there's actually a very exciting initiative that was developed a few years ago internationally, and it's called 30 by 30. And what it stands for is that every country in the world should try to preserve 30% of its wild lands and waters by the year 2030, right? That's huge. That's a really big goal. And you're already seeing dozens of countries signing on to the 30 by 30 pledge, including the United States. For example, I was very pleased to see that one of the first things the Biden administration did was to revoke the oil and gas permits in the Alaskan National Wildlife Refuge, which, of course, as many of us know, has been on the chopping block for decades upon decades. This is one of the most beautiful, pristine natural habitats in the world, with endangered species, with rare habitat that that's nowhere else. And so I'm so pleased to see that. So those are the types of things, and again, I mean, to go back to John Muir, I live in San Francisco, and for those of you that have been to San Francisco, the city itself is pretty populated with a lot of buildings, but just over the Golden Gate Bridge is Marin. And in Marin, that whole stretch of coast is completely protected, and it's known as the Marin Headlands. And that was a protected area that John Muir and the Sierra Club that he founded was protecting, and this was in the late 1800s. And they had the vision to see. They were just a handful of community members, that were passionate about hiking in the hills, and they had the vision to see, wait a minute, we should be protecting this land so that it doesn't get overdeveloped the way San Francisco undoubtedly will. And I'm so glad that they did, right? It's one of the most beautiful things, that we have that access to that open space. So yes, I mean, I think, whether it's golfing or hiking, and of course, we have to be aware that there are a lot of negative impacts on the environment through golfing, and I golf, so I can, I understand the tension, right? I mean, there is, a lot of pesticides, a lot of water usage, chemicals. There are more eco-friendly ways of doing that, right? But in general, we have an obligation to protect our wild spaces and keep them accessible to us, so that people can continue to enjoy them, so that future generations can continue to enjoy them. And I think, again, that's something that people on both sides of the aisle 100% agree on.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Once again, I have to, kind of give another shout out to my home state. West Virginia got its first national park, the New River Gorge National Park, that just happened the past 2 weeks.
Ooh,
it is
exciting.
It's a lovely spot. I remember when I was a child driving, because it's Route 19, the quote unquote hillbilly highway, that kind of gets you from Charleston to the border. And before the New River Gorge Bridge was built, you had to go down the mountain across this tiny little bridge on the New River and then back up the other mountain. And it added about 70 minutes. So their tagline was, by building this bridge, it turned a 70-minute drive into a 70-second drive. It's very, very, it's a little high for me. It's a little high. So I sort of, quickly move across the bridge, but it is a lovely, lovely new park. And I've been rafting on the New River, and it is truly, truly lovely.
Fantastic.
Yeah. I did see it, and what I like about your book is that, I almost view it as it's 3 sections. So, the first section, I see it as this introduction and how to start this conversation with folks. And in the middle section are all the great examples that, you would use in your arguments with folks, to show them that it is truly an across the aisle thing. And then, the very end of that the chapter 10 is like what we can do. And I found a lot of those, what we can do, very interesting, because I don't think that maybe we think a lot about it in our daily lives. We just sort of, almost automatically do things and don't think about it. But one of the things that I thought was so interesting was reducing food waste and reducing our personal food waste. And I just read an article about how France just passed a food waste legislation that, stores and bakeries and restaurants, instead of throwing away their unwanted food, they would be required to donate them to shelters.
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, that's very forward thinking, but it's almost things that we don't think about it. Like what does happen to that unused food that, isn't purchased at the grocery store, or even like on a personal use. It's like, I think I can eat 3 avocados when I go to the grocery store, but I only eat 2. And then that one rolls to the back of the bin. And it's like,
Well, you can always eat more avocado, Joe.
I mean, this is true. I think, it's like when things roll to the back of that vegetable bin, and then I get, I do get upset with myself. I'm like, oh, I plan to use this, and it just didn't pan out. But I mean, I think that's what's really encouraging about this last chapter of the book. It's like, it forces you to think about what you do as you kind of move around in your own environment, and what you do, not only with your pocketbook, but with your refrigerator and with your house and things like that. Gordon did chime back in as well, that he's seen the windmills when he was biking in the Great Allegheny Passage as well. But I think to wrap up this evening, and we did have a couple of good questions that I kind of wanted to combine in one here at the very end. Don't forget, folks, that if you want to order a copy of the book, Allie, who's working behind the scenes here at the Center for the Book, has put the link from Acapella Books. You can order it. We also have the link for revolve.org in there if you'd like to check that out as well. But Stephanie and a few other folks have asked about starting these conversations, and how do we plan on getting people to listen? How are we willing to take the first steps after people read your book? And are there ideas or themes that you want us to establish when we start these conversations with people?
Yeah, absolutely. And what Katharine Hayhoe would say, and what I repeat in the book, is first, it's about asking questions, and it's about listening and trying to understand somebody else's point of view, somebody else's values. What do they already care about? Because, what Katharine Hayhoe would say, and she's got a great TED talk about this that I highly recommend, and it's called "The Most Important Thing You Can Do About Climate Change is Talk About It." And what she says is that everything that you care about, that all of us care about, will be affected by climate change one way or another. So the first step is trying to figure out, what does this person really care about? Maybe it's their grandkids. Maybe it's, you know, maybe they're fishing. Maybe they are, you know, maybe they work in an industry that is energy intensive. Maybe they, you name it, whatever it is that they are passionate about, there is some impact that climate change will have on them. And so your job is to connect the dots, basically say, what is it that they care about? And then say, did you know, oh, you're you're an angler, you like to go fishing. Did you realize that as the climate changes, the temperature of the water is going to get warmer and it's going to impact the fish. I just saw today this horrible, this actually really made me kind of sad. Reef sharks are now getting these like lesions on their skin because the water is warming, right? And so, those are the kinds of things that people care about. There are shared values, whether it's open spaces, whether it's clean air, whether it's water, whether it's the health of their grandchildren. And so all you need to do is ask them, what they care about, find out what mutual interests you might have, establish some rapport, and then say, oh, by the way, did you know that this is how climate change is going to impact what it is that you care about? And that's how you get them to care as well. And again, I think, my take on it, and the reason I wrote the book is because it shouldn't just stop there. It shouldn't just stop with the person saying, oh, well, I guess there's this problem, cool, right? It has to go on to say, what can we do about it? And if that part isn't there, then, that person's not going to want to be thinking about it for very long. Wait a minute, you mean that my grandchildren are going to be growing up in this world that's going to be, a lot hotter and a lot more scary than this? I don't want to think about that. And so they're going to tune it out. They're going to forget about it. But if you tell them, hey, look, we've got a serious problem, not gonna lie, but guess what? Did you realize that, there are X number of jobs in clean energy in West Virginia that people are getting trained, that Solar Holler is this company that trains coal miners to become solar installers. Oh, no kidding. I didn't realize that, right? And the more that you talk about, and guess what? When we get to 100% clean energy, we're going to save $1 trillion a year on our electricity bills, and we're going to create a net 2 million jobs. Those are the types of positive anecdotes that can point people in the right direction and it remind us that we have some momentum, that this is the most important thing, is to remind people that this is a solvable problem. It's not something that we can't do anything about. We know what we need to do. We have to deploy clean energy. We have to get off of fossil fuels. And guess what? It's going to save us money. It's going to create jobs. It's going to improve our life. And that's the message that we need to be sending home.
Excellent. Well, thank you so very much, Andreas. It was such a wonderful talk. And I know people are definitely going to love to rewatch it again and again. Also, don't forget, Acapella Books is our bookseller this evening, and you can pick up a copy of Climate Courage from them by clicking the link or giving them a call. They are, of course, open for limited browsing, as well as doing mail to home and curbside pickup. Like so many of our independent bookstores, they have done so much during the pandemic to keep us well read and well informed. So I would encourage you that if you're not local, to find your local independent bookstore and to pick up a copy from them. Also, since it needs to be renewable, pass it along or check it out from your local library as well. We're great resources for reusing things like that. Andreas, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you to everyone who joined us from home. We are so grateful for you allowing us in your homes this evening to have this conversation with you. We look forward to talking with you again very, very soon. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.